You're recording? Okay. So when they gave me that class to teach, I took one look at the class and said, I don't want to teach this class, the most boring class I can think of. Because by the time I actually got the class, it was showing its age. It was a class that had been taught since the 1950s. And it was a collection of topics, 3 weeks on stocks and 2 weeks on bonds and 1 week on futures and 1 week on options and 5 weeks on institutional detail. Stuff like listing requirements for stock exchanges. So I took one look and said, I don't want to teach this class, which is not a great attitude if you've just been hired as an assistant professor, right? Before I keep going, I just want to make sure my sound's coming across okay and that everybody can hear me. I can't see what's on that sheet of paper, so it's just a blank sheet. Let's see if I can put it up. I'm seeing a blank classroom, and you're kind of faded into the bottom corner here. I don't even know how to bring you up, so. I'm sorry, this is new to me. I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing here. Okay, before I start talking, I don't want to talk for an hour and 40 minutes with nobody hearing me. Can somebody on the other side just tell me with an audio that you can hear me? Because I'm just going to take off these headphones and just talk. It's too. I can't hear. Nothing's coming. I can't hear you at all. Okay. Do you want me to try calling back on Skype? This is not. I mean, I have no idea whether you're hearing me, and you might. I don't want to talk for an hour. I can't hear a thing you're saying. So. Okay, I'm going to hang up and try again. This is not working because I have no idea whether it.
वीडियो डॉक्यूमेंट्स है ना हेलो
हाँ विनय
ओके
ओ आवाज आ रहा
हाँ
ओके ओके
नहीं दे रहा है सब कुछ
Are they getting his voice? They're getting his voice.
you no Vinay ji, are you getting the voice from my
हाँ यस वी कैन हियर यू
This thing doesn't have.
Okay, let's try this. Try 2.
Sir, we can hear you now. Finally.
I'm sorry?
Sir, we are you're audible now. You weren't audible earlier.
I wasn't on audible earlier. Good thing I didn't talk for 90 minutes and nobody would have heard me. So now I'm okay? Okay, so
Yes, sir.
let me pull up the slides and tell me whether you can see them. Can you see my slides now?
Blank screen, sir.
Blank screen?
Yeah, we saw. We can see your slide.
Okay. I'm going to talk for about 85 minutes and then I'll put the headphones on because otherwise it's too disorienting for me. So as long as you can hear me, if you cannot hear me, put up your hands. That's the only way I'll know, okay?
Okay, sir.
So let's get started. I came to NYU in 1986, and when I came to NYU in 1986, they gave me a class to teach. It was called Security Analysis. If you've never heard of this is a class with a long and very hoary tradition. It's in fact the class that a guy called Ben Graham taught at Columbia University in 1950 that was taken by Warren Buffett. And I mean, it's a famous class. So they gave me this class to teach, and I took one look and I said, I don't want to teach this class. It's the most boring class I can think of. This is a collection of topics by 1986. It was 3 weeks on stocks, and 2 weeks on bonds, and 2 weeks on futures, and 1 week on options, and 5 weeks on institutional detail. You're saying, like what? There was an entire class on listing requirements for the New York Stock Exchange. I mean, teaching was so easy the days before Wikipedia. I mean, basically, you could come to class and list out the 12 requirements, and everybody said, that's amazing. But I took one look and said, I don't want to teach this class. So I went to the head of the department and said, I'd like to teach a valuation class. And he said, don't do it. There isn't enough stuff in valuation to actually fill a class. And you know what? He was absolutely right. In 1986, there wasn't enough stuff in valuation to actually teach a class. But I really, really, really wanted to do it. And I discovered very early in my academic life that to get something done in academia, the best way to do it is to do it subversively. Because if you try to get official permission, it'll never get done. So here's what I did. I said, okay, I'll teach a security analysis class. And I walked in and I taught a valuation class. They have no idea what I do in a classroom. I could be teaching cooking for all you know. You know how long it took them to find out? In 2008, think about it, 2008, I get a call from the dean's office. And they say, well, we hear you're teaching a valuation class. And I said, yes, I've been doing it for 22 years. They said, we don't see it on the schedule. I said, that's because I've been hijacking all these other classes you've been giving me and teaching a valuation class instead. This will be my 31st year teaching valuation, my 53rd semester teaching valuation. And everything I know about valuation, I've learned in the course of teaching this class. Notice how I phrased that. I didn't know it before I taught the class. I've learned during the course of teaching the class. So I'm going to start off with 2 questions that I start every one of my valuation classes with. And I'm going to throw the questions out. I don't know whether if you can respond, great. And if I can hear you, even better. But here's my first question. Is valuation an art or a science? Think about it for just a moment. Is it an art or a science? Let's start with the second half of that question. Is physics a science? Sure, right? Is math a science? Absolutely. In fact, mathematicians are convinced that the only pure science is mathematics. Think about what makes math a science. What makes a math a science is its input-output. If you get the inputs right, you're going to get the output right? Physics is a science because the laws of gravity are the laws of gravity. No matter who it is, if you jump out of the 25th floor of a building, you're going to hit the ground and the law of gravity is going to work on you. Physics is a science, math is a science. There's sciences because if you get the inputs right, you get the output right. So let me ask you a question. Do you think valuation is a science? In other words, if you get the inputs right in valuing a company, you're going to get the output right. And if you think about it for a moment, you can see very quickly it cannot be a science. You can get every single input right and be horribly wrong when it comes to the output. So let's get that out of the way. Valuation is not a science. Is valuation an art? We know painting is an art. What makes this Picasso guy so special? I've never understood it. The guy gets a nose in the wrong place in every single painting. But for whatever reason, we've all collectively decided Picasso, the guy is a genius, his painting's worth 100 million. If I try to paint faces with noses coming out of the side of the head, I'm not getting 80 million or 100 million. The essence of an art is you cannot teach it. Thank God valuation is not an art. Otherwise I wasted 31 years of my life trying to teach something that cannot be taught. So if it's not an art, it's not a science, what the heck is it? I'll give you the word that I use to describe valuation. It's a craft. I'll give you what is closest to valuation in my view. Cooking. Think about how you master cooking. Do you master cooking by watching cooking shows on TV? You could try. My daughter does it all the time. She can't cook a lick. She watches cooking shows all day. You learn cooking by reading cookbooks. You could try. But reading cookbooks is not going to make you a cook. To learn cooking, what do you have to do? You have to go into that room in your apartment or house called the kitchen, and you have to start cooking. And the first time you cook, guess what happens? Disaster. I remember the first time I scrambled eggs. Nobody told me you're supposed to spray the pan before you scrambled eggs. I had to throw the pan and the eggs into the trash can. But I learned. You learn cooking by doing. You learn valuation by doing. In my valuation class, actually, starting at the very first week of class, it's a 15-week class, I put up what's called a valuation of the week, which means I value a company and I put it up. And I tell everybody in the class to try their hand at the valuation. And the first week, the response I get is, but it's the first week, we haven't learned valuation yet. So don't worry, just give it your best shot. Change whatever you feel comfortable changing. And the first week when they do it, they just change the second decimal point on my risk-free rate and say, I got a value just like yours. So actually at the end of the first week, I put up a histogram of the valuations of the people in the class. There are about 300 people in the class. The 300 valuations that come in, they're all around my valuation. It's like one big bar around my value. And then I put up a valuation each week. And each week I pick a different company to value. So the first week I might pick Apple. The second week I picked a Nigerian company called PZ Cousins Nigeria. The third week I might pick Tata Motors. Basically each week I pick a company, people try valuing the company. And here's how I know the class is working. As I go further and further into the class, people feel more willing to disagree with me. In fact, by the 8th or the 9th week, somebody in the class will come up and say, everything you did in that valuation was wrong. I say, that's good, the class is working. You learn valuation by doing. So if you want to master valuation, stop sitting in classrooms like this one and listening to people like me. Stop reading valuation books. They're going, this is not a novel. Pick a company, value it. Pick another company, value it. Pick a third company as different from the first two, value that company. Each time you value a company, you will get a little better at the craft of valuation. So I'm going to ask you the second question. This is a question that I did not ask when I first started teaching class, and I'll tell you why in a few minutes. So this is a question that you can put up your hands as I ask this question, because I want you to look inwards. There is no right answer to the question. If I asked you to classify yourself as a person right now, would you classify yourself more as a storyteller or a number cruncher? Think about it for just a moment and ask yourself the question, are you more naturally a number cruncher or a storyteller? You think, how would I know? I'll tell you how I knew and when I knew. I knew when I was about maybe 13 years old. It was after my first English literature class. And I was asked to read Moby Dick. And I did. I was a good kid. I read the book and I thought it was about a whale and Captain Ahab. So I show up in class ready to talk about whales and captains. And about 15 minutes in the class, I realized that nobody's talking about whales and nobody's talking about captains. And the instructor starts talking about all these hidden meanings behind the book. And I remember sitting there saying, really? Really? That's what Herman Melville was thinking when he wrote that? And I remember walking out of the class with a singular feeling. I said, never again am I going to subject myself to this kind of bullshit. And the rest of my high school life was laid out for me. I avoided the literature classes like the plague. It was Algebra 1, Algebra 2, Algebra 3 out of high school. And these were the good old days. We could go to college and just take numbers courses. And I took all numbers courses. I got a numbers degree. I went on to get a numbers MBA, a numbers PhD. I would have gone on to a number. I thought of myself as a numbers person. But I'm a numbers person. But there were people in my class that 13-year or 14, when I was 13 or 14 years old, that same literature class, who thought was amazing about these hidden meanings. They said, this is what I want to do. They're the poets. You ever met a poet? My son is a poet. My youngest son, he's 18 now. He writes great poetry. He showed me his first poem, and he's never going to show me another one, I think. He gave me his first poem. I took a look at it and I said, Kiran, I think you have a problem. I think in poems, the last words are supposed to rhyme, aren't they? He said, Dad, you're not a poet. And he said, you're right. So I divide the world into number crunchers and storytellers, and I want you to look inwards and think about which one you are. So you had a chance to think? How many of you are number crunchers? Okay. How many of you are storytellers? Okay. Some of you are not quite sure, so that's okay. So there are more number crunchers than storytellers, and that is the story of almost every business school classroom in India. I went to IIM Bangalore in 1979. There were, I think, my class was 100 and something students. I think there were 112 engineers and 3 non-engineers in the entire class. This was number crunching king. I mean, it was everywhere you looked, there was another number cruncher. But that's the question I start with. And in my valuation class, out of the 300, here's what tends to happen. About 180 are number crunchers. There's a selection bias. You take a valuation class if you like numbers. So those 180 are my number crunchers. The remaining 120, and I'm lucky. These are the history majors from Yale, are storytellers. And of course, when I ask this question, their first reaction is, what are these storytellers doing in this class? This is a valuation class. Okay? And that's when in fact, if you think about it, this is like the legend of the left brain and the right brain. The left brain is supposed to control logic, and the right brain is supposed to control your creative instincts. I have 180 left brainers and 120 right brainers, and I would say the same thing is probably true in almost every classroom I walk into. There are more number crunchers than storytellers, and the number crunchers think that they have the advantage. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about why this is a dangerous game. So I want to draw on the number crunchers here, and I'm a fellow number cruncher, and I want to talk a little bit about the delusions that number crunchers have, and you tell me whether you share these delusions. The first is what I call the delusion of precision. You know what I mean by that? When in doubt, here's what number crunchers do. They add decimals. Makes them feel more secure. I have 5 decimals. Look, I can go to 8 decimals. That's a delusion of precision. Adding extra decimals makes you feel more in control. The second is the delusion of being objective. You say, I'm just using numbers. I'm being unbiased. The reality is you can hide lots of bias in numbers. As somebody who does valuation, I can show you places to hide bias. Nobody will even look. And the third is the delusion of being in control. You think because you have a number for something, you're in control of it. So if you're a number cruncher, those are your delusions. And I shared those delusions. When I first started teaching this class in 1986, I taught it as a number cruncher. I had the delusion of precision, the delusion of being objective, the delusion of being in control. Now let's think about the storytellers, because they have their own set of delusions. The first delusion of being a storyteller is that number crunchers don't have imaginations. They don't even dream in color. They dream in black and white. The second is you think that being creative should be its own reward. You come up with this great story and say, I should be worth at least 10 billion, right? Because I told you a great story. And the third is, and this drives me crazy, storytellers love giving anecdotal evidence. They're like my mother-in-law. And I don't mean that as a compliment. Because here's how my mother-in-law forms conclusions. I'll tell you one example. About 10 years ago, we're sitting around the dinner table and my mother-in-law says, the best car to drive in a snowstorm is a Volkswagen Bug. And I said, what? A Volkswagen Bug. Remember the small bugs that you used to be able to pick up with your hands and put in another spot? I said, why would you say something like that? A light car like that in a snowstorm? Why would you think that? I should never ask these questions because she told me. She said 20 years prior, She was in Lake Tahoe and it was snowing. And she was in a Volkswagen Bug driving on the highway, and 2 cars in front of her went off the road and she got home. And I said, so? She said, that proves it, doesn't it? The Volkswagen Bug is much better than any other car on the highway. Sample size of 1. Amazing how you can generalize. Number crunchers have their delusions. Storytellers have their own delusions. So here's the way I think about valuation. And to me, this is the essence of valuation. And it took me a while to get to. A good valuation is a bridge between stories and numbers. And here's what I mean by that. If you show me a valuation of a company and I point to a number and say, why is your revenue in year 10 90 billion? You know what the answer I don't want to hear is? Because I used a 15% growth rate for the first 5 years and 8% thereafter. I want to hear your story about the company that backs at 90 billion. Every number in a valuation should have a story behind it. And every story you tell should have a number attached to it. So valuation is about connecting stories to numbers. So let me go back to my classroom. I want 180 number crunchers and 120 storytellers, right? So I turn to each group and I tell them what my hope is for the class. I first turn to the storytellers and say, by the end of this class, here's what I hope will happen. I hope you will learn enough number crunching to develop some discipline. You know what I mean by discipline, right? Storytellers left to themselves will get carried away. They'll tell fairy tales. So I hope you learn enough number crunching to be disciplined. Disciplined storytellers. Then I turn to the number cruncher and say, by the end of this class, I hope you develop an imagination. Imaginative number crunchers. Disciplined storytellers. I told you this is my 53rd semester teaching this class. So I've run into this issue at least for the last 20 years. Trying to make storytellers more disciplined and number crunchers more imaginative. Guess which group I have more trouble with every single semester. Getting storytellers to develop discipline or number crunchers to develop an imagination. It's not even close. Every single semester, it's the number crunchers I have more trouble with. I can teach a history major from Yale enough number crunching to value a company tomorrow. You give me an engineer, I'm dead in the water. Getting you guys to let go of a lifetime of holding on to numbers is really tough to do. It's almost like this is a life vest and you want to hold on to it and say, you can swim. No, I can't swim. I have to hold on to the life vest. So what I'd like to talk a little bit about is this process of building a bridge between storytelling and number crunching. And I'm going to take you through a 5-step process that I go through to value a company. And this is a process that I came to late in the game. And let me explain what I mean by coming late to the game. I taught my first valuation class in '86. I taught it as a number cruncher does, which is lots of numbers, lots of equations, every loose end tied up, nice and clean number crunching. And I did that for about 6 years. And I discovered about 6 or 7 years into teaching this class that I had a problem. Here's what the problem was. I could put numbers into a spreadsheet and value a company. I had no trouble with the mechanics of valuation, but I had no faith in my own valuation. That's a strange word to use, right? Faith. But think about why you do valuation. You do valuation because you want to act on that valuation. So if you find something to be cheap, you want to buy the stock. If you find something to be expensive, you want to sell the stock. I had no faith. And I discovered that I had no faith 7 years into the process. That's when I learned that unless I learned to tell stories, I would never be able to act on my valuations. I had to teach myself storytelling, and it wasn't easy. It was like that first scrambled eggs episode. Basically, the first time I tried to tell a story, it was a disaster. But I've become a little better over time as I've had to do this over and over again. So when I sit down to value a company, I still force myself to go through this 5-step process. Because what it does is it makes me think of a story before I open a spreadsheet. Because my first instinct when I want to value a company is open a spreadsheet, start entering numbers, and I have to fight that instinct. So here's the 5-step process. Let me lay out the steps. And then I'm going to take 2 companies to illustrate this process through these steps. The first step in the process. is understanding your company. What I call surveying the landscape. Understand your company, understand the business, understand the competition, and then tell a story about your company that reflects what you know about the company. There's this old saying, you can't value a company unless you really understand the company. And I want to make that real because too many people value companies without having the slightest understanding of what the company does, what it produces, why people like its products, why people work for it. First step is I want to tell a story about the company based on my understanding of the company. Second step in the process, I want to make sure the story I've told you is possible, it's plausible, it's probable. 3 P words, but 3 words with very different degrees of proof needed. Let's take possible. Is it possible is the weakest question. Lots of things are possible, so I want to make sure I'm not telling you an impossible story. A subset of possible stories are plausible. To be plausible, you got to show me that somebody has done something like this in the past. And then you got to go to probable. You got to show me what you're going to do to make the story likely happen for you. Is it possible? Is it plausible? Is it probable? And a surprising number of business stories fail one or the other of these tests. So is the story possible? Is it plausible? Is it probable? Third step in the process, now that I've established that the story is possible, plausible, and probable, is I'm going to convert my story into inputs in my valuation, numbers that go into my valuation. Every part of your story has to become a number. And once those numbers go into evaluation in step 4, the valuation itself becomes almost an afterthought. It comes out of your inputs. And then comes the most difficult part of this process. Remember, this is your story and your valuation. If I ask you, do you like your story? Your response is going to be, of course, it's great, it's a wonderful story. And when you present your valuation, you know what you want people to do? You want them to pat you on the back and say, great story, amazing story. I want you to avoid those people. I want you to present your valuations to people who think least like you, who are most likely to disagree with you. And then listen when they critique you. Listen, don't go into denial, don't get defensive, listen. Because if you want to tell a good story, you have to improve your story based on what people find wrong with the story. 5-step process. As I said, I'm going to take 2 companies through this process. And I lay the companies out before I go into this process. The first company I'm going to value is Uber. I'm sure you've heard of Uber. Uber is the largest private company in the world in terms of market value now. It's about $70 billion. It's in 400 cities. It's pretty much everywhere in the world. Last summer when I was traveling all over the world, I went to Sao Paulo, I went to Moscow, I went to Jakarta. Every city I went in every seminar, I asked for a show of hands. How many people in this room came to the seminar on Uber? And in every single city I went, and this was on 4 continents, at least a third of the room had got there with Uber. So it's clearly a company that seems to have breached some weakness in the wall. So the first company I'm going to talk about is Uber. And I'm going to tell you the story that I told about Uber in June of 2014 and the valuation I did in June of 2014. Then I'm going to show you the update that I did for Uber in September of 2015 and what changed between June and September of 2015. The second company I'm going to tell a story about in value is Ferrari. You heard of Ferrari, right? Company that went public in 2015. You see, that late? Ferrari's been around since 1948. But in 1968, Enzo Ferrari used to own Ferrari, ran into some financial trouble, and he sold off 90% of the company to Fiat at that time. And for 50 years, Ferrari was part of Fiat Chrysler. And in 2016, Fiat Chrysler finally decided to take Ferrari public. So I'm going to tell you the story I told about Ferrari at the time that it went public and the valuation that came out of it. So let's get the show on the road. Let's start with the first step in this process, which is understanding the business. I call this surveying the landscape. It sounds fancy. But this is really about understanding your company, the business, the environment, the competition, etc. And to collect this data, don't just look at financial statements. Don't look at what other people write about the company. Talk to people. Talk to people who use the company's products. Talk to people who work at the company. Get an understanding of the company. So let me start off with Uber in June of 2014. The way I got to learn about Uber is in June of 2014, the Wall Street Journal there was an article in the Wall Street Journal that said Uber had just raised money from venture capitalists who had priced the company at $17 billion. I must admit, I was surprised. I didn't even know what Uber did. I would tell you I'd never heard of Uber, but that would be a lie because I'd seen Uber on my credit card statements in 3 months leading into June of 2014. Turned out that my son, who was going to college in North Carolina, had decided to use Uber and decided to use my credit card to back up his Uber. Don't ask me how that happened. But I thought he was taking German language classes, to be quite honest. So I had no idea what Uber did. So I said, this is interesting, a company I've never heard of, a German language class worth $17 billion. So I called my son. He was still sleeping. It was still 11:30 in the morning. He was not awake. He kept college hours. So I called my niece, who was working in Chicago, and I said, what's this Uber thing? She said, it's a ride-sharing service. I said, what the hell is a ride-sharing service? She said, I don't have the time to help you because I'm busy. Very rude. But you can find out for yourself. Why don't you just download the app? So I said, sure. So I downloaded the app. This neat little Uber app shows up on my phone. I hit the app. I'm in my office in New York City, and I see this GPS open up and a car start driving towards me. Never happened before. And there's this guy called George sitting in the front seat. And I said, this is amazing. That's an Uber car. There's George driving it towards, and he pulls up in front of 44 West 4th Street, which is where I teach. I run under the car and I say, hey, hi George, how are you? And he says, where do you want to go? I said, nowhere. I just want to drive around for about 45 minutes. I have some questions to ask you. For a moment, he thought I was a serial killer. But then he took one look at me and said, I can take this guy. Get in the back seat. So I get in the back seat and I start asking him questions. I said, is this an Uber car you're driving? He said, no, this is my car. I said, are you an Uber employee? He said, no. I have a regular job. I'm an independent contractor. And this allows me to earn a second income. I said, why do you need Uber? He said, in New York City, you're not allowed to pick up passengers on the street. It's illegal to actually stop on the street and ask them whether they want a ride. Uber connects me with customers. So at this stage, I had an idea of why this driver used Uber. It allowed him to earn a second income with a car he already owned, paying the same insurance he was paying before, and Uber allowed him to connect with customers. So 45 minutes later, he drops me off in front of my office. I offer to pay him. He said, you don't have to pay me. I said, it's free. He said, no, it's not free. You put your credit card into the app, right? I said, yes. And they're going to charge you. And I said, how do you get paid? And I still remember what he said. He said, they said 80% of whatever the fare is. And I remember asking, why 80%? He said, I don't know. That's what they all do. I said, okay. Now I saw why Uber did what they did. For connecting these drivers to customers, they got to keep 20% of the fare. That's a sweet business to be in. So I understood why Uber did what they did. I understood why drivers drove for Uber. The final loose end for me in understanding the business was, why do customers like Uber? So this time I called my son at what I thought was a civilized hour, like 3:30 in the afternoon when he was finally awake. And my son has a car in North Carolina. So I said, why are you taking this Uber ride-share? I acted like I knew what a ride-sharing service was right from the beginning. So why are you taking a ride-sharing service and putting it on my credit card? So I put him on the defensive right off the top because that'll actually give you the upper hand of this. So I said, why are you doing this if you already own a car? And he said, Dad, on Friday nights and Saturday nights, I really like Uber. Now there are some questions as a father you never want to follow up and find out more. I kind of understood. But this is a kid who left to his own devices would never call a cab. Never ever. Not in this lifetime. So I asked him, what is it you like about Uber? What is so special about Uber? No. He said, I can call the car from the bar. I don't have to go out onto the street. I said, okay, that's interesting. I said, but these cars must cost a lot more than cabs, right? He said, no, they cost less than a cab. I said, you must wait forever, right? He said, they come quicker than a cab. So they said, let me get this straight. They're cheaper than a cab. They're quicker than a cab. They must be filthy, right? He said, no, they're cleaner than a cab. That's when I knew cab service was destined for doom. Because Uber was cleaner, faster, and safer. Why would you ever take a cab? So I kind of understood why ride-sharing was going to conquer the car service business. Which left me with one final question. What's so special about Uber? Why couldn't I start a ride-sharing service in my basement? And there were three things that I could think of that gave Uber an advantage over me. The first was $3 billion. That's what they raised from venture capitalists. Uber had $3 billion. I didn't. That kind of gives them an advantage. The second is there's a networking benefit, which is as Uber collects drivers into its network, it gets more difficult for other people to break in because the network gets bigger. If you're a new driver, you want to join the bigger network. If you're a new customer, you want to join the bigger network. So that was a networking benefit. And the third advantage is Uber does use the data that they collect about you in inventive ways. Like how? You've heard of surge pricing, right? So if you take Uber during rush hour or on New Year's Eve, it's going to cost you a lot more than if you take Uber at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That's because they have computers that trace out where the demand and supply is coming from and use prices to make demand equate supply. So at that stage, I kind of understood Uber. And you can see when I talk about doing research, understanding the business, I'm really talking about doing this kind of questioning, listening to people. And in fact, when I was done with all of this, I drew a picture of Uber. And this is something I try to do with almost every company I value. Is once I understand the company, I try to think about why do customers like its products? Why do employees work for it? How does it make money? How does it grow? In the case of Uber, to grow, because they don't own the cars, they don't hire the drivers, it's going to be easy for them to grow. It's going to be easy to scale up. It gives you an understanding of the company. And it's a platform from which I'm going to build the Uber story. Now, when you're asked to do research in a company, I know we train you to do this. Here's what you're asked to do. Go collect the financial data, the annual reports, the 10Ks. With Uber, even if I'd wanted to, I couldn't have got that information. You know why, right? It's a private company. There were no financial statements, no public disclosures. But even if I'd got my hands on the public information, what would it have told me? This is a young company. There's nothing there yet. Looking at last year's financials is going to tell you nothing about the company. A few weeks ago, I valued Snap for their IPO. And they do have financials. I took a look at the financials. There was nothing I learned about Snap, or very little I learned about Snap from looking at the financials. I learned more by looking at the business they were in, their competition, and how they were growing than by looking at the company. So that's the starting point for this process, is understanding a company. And in June of 2014, this was my understanding of Uber. So let's turn to the other company, Ferrari. What business is Ferrari in? That's an easy one, right? It's in the car business. And that's bad news. Why is it bad news? Because the car business is one of the 10 worst businesses in the world to be in. Let me back that statement up. If you look at the automobile business collectively, leading into 2015, which is when Ferrari had its IPO, between 2005 and 2014, if you look at the revenue growth, global automobile companies, all of them put together, the compounded revenue growth was 5.6% a year for the entire business. That includes emerging markets, growing markets, everything put together. Revenue growth is anemic. And half of that revenue growth comes from China. I tell my MBAs, whenever you're asked a question to which you don't know the answer, let's say you're in an interview, somebody asks a question you don't know the answer to. Try this. Just say China. Say it with a profound tone. It's amazing how often China is the answer to pretty much every question that gets asked. So in this case, your revenue growth is anemic and half that growth comes from China. So that's the first piece of bad news. Here's the second piece of bad news. If you look at the operating margins of automobile companies, they're abysmal. The median operating margin is not even net profit margin, it's operating profit margin. The median operating margin for an automobile company is 4.4%. 4.4%, and a third of all automobile companies lose money. So you have low revenue growth, you have terrible margins. Let's nail the coffin shut. Usually if you're a company with low revenue growth, you can get away not building new assembly plants, not reinvesting. Automobile companies, unfortunately, have had to reinvest more and more every year for the last 10 years. You know what? Computers. Because if you look at a new car, it's more computer than car. R&D has risen as a portion of investment. So here's what you have at automobile companies. Low revenue growth, bad margins, lots of reinvestment. The way this manifests itself is in 9 of the last 10 years, automobile companies have earned a return on capital lower than their cost of capital. This is a business where forget about making money. You're having a tough time just breaking even. And this is the business that Ferrari is in. That's the bad news. You're saying, what's the good news? Well, the good news is Ferrari is not just another automobile company. In fact, I'm not even sure Ferrari is a car company. It's a very impractical car if you think about it. There's one guy in my town who owns a Ferrari. I've never seen him drive it. It's kept in an extra armored garage with 2 security guards in front of it. You can break into his house, steal everything you want, but his car is protected. Rumor is once every year he takes the car out of the garage, he drives it around town, and then drives it back to the garage and locks it up for the rest of the year. And who could blame him? What are you going to do with a Ferrari? Drive it to the grocery store? Can you imagine driving your Ferrari to the grocery store, parking it, going inside and coming out? You might have $15,000 worth of damage before you come out. How about doing carpool with the Ferrari? You have 4 kids to pick up in 1 seat. This isn't going to work. So why do people buy Ferraris? This is an expensive car you never drive. And here's my answer. They drive it because they become part of a very exclusive club. How exclusive? In all of 2014, which is the most recent fiscal year leading into the IPO, Ferrari sold 7,255 cars. Whole year, entire world. 7,255. Think about it. Volkswagen probably rejects that many cars on its assembly line every day. 7,255 cars, whole year. You think that's awful. That's the bad news. They don't sell very many cars. Here's the good news. Their operating margin is 18.2%. Do you remember what it was for automobile companies collectively? It was 4.4%. They have an operating margin 4 times higher. Why? Because they charge a hefty price and they don't spend any money on advertising. I've never seen a Ferrari ad where they say, 10% off, come on in. That's not the kind of person they want coming in anyway. In fact, I'm not even sure how you buy a Ferrari. You probably go into a dealership and they ask you for references. How many billionaires do you know? None. Get out of here. This is an exclusive club and they want everybody walking and buying a Ferrari. So they don't sell very many cars. They have this huge margin. And here's the final bonus they get. Usually if you sell luxury goods, like Gucci, Tiffany's, what usually happens is in good times you sell a lot, in bad times your revenues drop off because people can't afford to buy it. Ferrari sells to people who are so rich that if you ask them, how's the economy doing? Their answer is, what's an economy? Because these are people who are so rich that to them a bad year is, I'm worth only 4 billion, not 7 billion. They're not exactly cutting costs. So the way this shows up is if you look at the number of cars Ferrari sells, they've sold about 7,000 cars for the last 10 years, including 2009, which was one of the worst economic years for pretty much everybody on the face of the planet. This is a company which doesn't sell very many cars, but has huge margins and is relatively stable. That's going to become part of my story. My story for Ferrari is going to reflect that reality. So when I talk about doing research for a company, people are so caught up in going through 10Ks and financial reports that they forget to talk to people. Talk to the janitor in the company. Talk to people who use the company's products, because that's the way you start understanding what the company does, what makes it successful or what makes it unsuccessful. Which brings me now to the second step in the process. Now that I have the background in both companies, I'm ready to tell a story. Before you get launched into a business story, a couple of things to remember. One is when you tell a business story, you want to keep it simple. As opposed to what? I remember about 10 years ago, my oldest son, who's now 27, came to me and said, Dad, I found this great book and I love the book and I think you should read it too. And I take my son's and my daughter's suggestions on what to read very seriously. So I said, okay, Ryan, I'll read whatever you're reading. So he gives me this book. It's 1,000 pages thick. It's written by a guy called George R. Martin. It's the first Game of Thrones book. I started reading the book and I promise you I tried. But about 600 pages into the book, I called my son and I said, Ryan, I can't take this anymore. I'm too old for this. There are like hundreds of characters in this book. Half of them died and the other half come back to life. There are these 6 empires. I've lost track of everybody in the book, all the empires. I give up. So here's my suggestion to you. You're trying to tell a business story. Don't make it Game of Thrones. You don't have 7 seasons and 70 episodes to tell your story. You probably have 10 minutes. So keep it simple. Second, keep it focused on what? What's the end game for every business? I don't care whether you're Flipkart, Ola, or both of them rolled together. Ultimately, every business has to make money. So show me your pathway to make money. Stop talking about users and app downloads. I don't care. So you have lots of users, amazing, wonderful. But I can't pay dividends with users. It's kind of an interesting concept. I'll send 3 users home with you today. You invest in my stock. You have to give me the pathway to making money. So every business story should be simple and focused. So ready? I'm going to tell you 2 business stories. One about Uber in June of 2014 and one about Ferrari in October of 2015. As you listen to these stories, you're probably going to say, I'd have told a different story. You're right. This is my story. You want to tell your own story? Tell your own story. Every valuation reflects a story. So I'm going to tell you my stories about Uber and Ferrari. So let's start with Uber. In Uber for June of 2015, here's the story that I told. As I go through the story, every word is going to come back in my valuation, so keep track of every word. I described Uber as an urban car service company. Already you can see where I see Uber succeeding, right? Urban basically means I expect it to succeed in cities and big towns as a car service business. Second, that's going to attract new users into this business. Like who? Like my son. Somebody who would never have taken traditional car service who's going to come into the business. And has local networking benefits. Remember I talked about how as you get bigger, it gets easier for you to get bigger as a ride-sharing company. If Uber becomes the largest ride-sharing company in New York, it's going to become very difficult for you to break into New York, and Uber is going to get even bigger. But you think, what's the local there? If Uber becomes the largest ride-sharing company in New York, it'll dominate New York. But let's say I fly to Chicago. I land in Chicago. I don't care who the largest ride-sharing company in New York is anymore. I care about the largest ride-sharing company in Chicago. And if that is Lyft, that's who I'm going to take. So in my story, here's what can happen. Uber can end up dominating New York. Lyft can end up dominating Chicago. Didi Chuxing can end up dominating Beijing. And Ola can end up dominating Mumbai. And you think, so what? In my story, you're going to have a splintered market where you could have 7 or 8 different ride-sharing companies dominating different parts of the world. And that's going to play a role in how much value I attach to Uber. I'm also going to assume that Uber is going to be able to maintain that 80-20 mix that they have right now, which is completely arbitrary if you think about it, that 80% of the fare goes to the driver and 20% to Uber. I think Ola is 80-20 as well, but Ola just copied Uber. But if you look at Malaysia, Grab Taxi is 85-15. It's all over the place. There's no rhyme or reason to it, but I'm going to assume the 80-20 is kind of stuck. And finally, I'm going to assume that Uber is going to continue with its existing capital model, where it doesn't own the cars, it doesn't hire the drivers, and that's going to play a role in how much value I attach to Uber. So remember the story, because every part of the story is going to become a number in my valuation. So let's talk about Ferrari. So in my story, Ferrari is going to stay an exclusive club, with all its pluses and minuses. Let's start with the minus. Because Ferrari is going to stay an exclusive club, when I think about revenue growth at Ferrari, I have to be careful, right? I couldn't put in 20% growth. Not because they cannot grow at 20%, but if they grow at 20%, think of what's going to happen. That guy in my town who owns a Ferrari is going to go out and sell it right away because there are going to be 3 other people who own a Ferrari. To stay exclusive, you got to keep your ambitions inbound. You got to keep it low. Revenue growth has got to be low. That's the bad news. The good news is your margins will stay high. And when I think about the risk in your company, it's going to be muted because you're selling to people who are so rich that they don't feel the effects of the economy. So there's my Ferrari story, an exclusive club. There's my Uber story, an urban car service company. I'm now ready to take the next step. And in the next step, and this is a step which I find particularly useful, I have to stop and ask myself these questions. Is the story you've told possible? Is it plausible? Is it probable? You say, what's the difference? Possible is a very weak test. I want to make sure my story is possible in the sense to show you it's not impossible. But lots of possible stories are not plausible. To be plausible, you have to show me evidence that somebody else has done something like this before, or you've been able to do something like this somewhere. And for it to be probable, you got to go the extra step and show me the pieces you have in place to pull this off. Is it possible? Is it plausible? Is it probable? Let me give you very simple examples of impossible, implausible, and improbable stories so you can see this play out. Let's start with the impossible stories. About 7 or 8 months ago, I was looking at a prospectus on an M&A deal, pretty big one. It was when Tesla bought Solar City. Tesla and Solar City are both, the CEO of Tesla is Elon Musk, and he's also the largest shareholder in Solar City. So when Tesla bought Solar City, there's a tremendous number of conflicts of interest that had to be dealt with. So to cover themselves, Tesla and Solar City hired 2 investment bankers. Each had an investment banker to give what I would call fairness opinions. Fairness opinions in the US are required in M&A deals so that you don't get sued. So Tesla's investment banker was an investment bank called Evercore, which is a pretty well-known investment bank, a boutique investment bank in New York. And Solar City had hired Lazard. So this prospectus described how Lazard and Tesla and Evercore came up with the fairness opinions, the fair values they gave to do. And let's face it, the job of an investment bank is to make sure the deal gets done. And I know that. I'm cynical about it. I understand that investment bankers will find every conceivable way to justify a deal, even if it's a bad deal. So I was willing to cut some slack when I looked at these valuations because I knew investment banks had to get deals done. So I was looking at Evercore's valuation of Tesla. So I'm looking at it, and first I look at the cash flows. And Evercore confesses that they got the cash flows from Tesla's board of directors. So Evercore is doing a fairness opinion in Tesla, and it's getting the cash flows from Tesla. I don't know what's fair about that, but I was willing to cut them some slack and let it go. So they get cash flows for the next 5 years. At the end of 5 years, they get to 2021. They don't have any cash flows anymore. And you can't just let the company fall off the cliff. So they assume a growth rate after 2021, which is pretty standard. Valuations, you often do that to get a terminal value. And the growth rate they estimate for Tesla after 2021 was 6% a year forever. And my jaw dropped. I said, 6% a year forever? What currency are they doing the valuation in? Maybe it's Argentine pesos. So I called somebody at Evercore and I said, what currency are you doing? They said, US dollars. And I said, how can you be using a 6% growth rate? They said, well, Tesla is a high growth company. So I asked them the question. I said, what do you think would happen to Tesla if it kept growing at 6% a year forever? In a US economy that's growing at 2% in nominal terms, maybe 2.5%. It's a math problem, right? You let one number grow at 6% forever, you let another number grow at 2.5%. Sooner or later, the first number is going to get bigger than the second number. So in about 30 years, Tesla is going to become the US economy. Okay, globalization. 30 years after that, Tesla is going to become the global economy. Then what? Interplanetary travel? Where are you going to get these extra cars? I can't even visualize a world that's all Tesla all the time. You'd have to live in your Tesla, you'd have to eat your Tesla, you'd have to get healthcare from your Tesla. This is an impossible valuation. No company can grow at a rate faster than the economy forever. You'd be amazed at how many DCFs I see that violate that first principle. They're impossible valuations. Here's a second example of an impossible valuation. Every person in my class is to pick a company to value. They can pick whatever company they want and live with the consequences. So about 2 years ago, somebody in the class picks Netflix to value. Exciting company, high growth company, but a company where it's really very difficult to get the intrinsic value up to the market price because it's so richly priced. So this guy comes back with a value that's 4 times larger than the market price. And I'm shocked and say, what did he do? How did he come up with a value so high? So I take a look at his valuation and I look at his revenues. And he's projecting revenues of $600 billion for Netflix in the 10th year. 600 billion. So I called the kid into my office. He's not even a kid. He's like 29 years old. So I said, I'm looking at your valuation. Do you have Netflix? He said, yes. I said, how much do you pay a year? So he pulled out his calculator. Seemed to be attached to his hip. Worked through the numbers. They're about $100 a year. I said, let me ask you a question. How many subscribers would Netflix need to have in year 10 to have $600 billion in revenues? He pulls out his calculator again. He said, you don't need a damn calculator. $600 billion, you get $100 per year. That's 6 billion subscribers. He says, I don't know where this is going. I said, just hang in there. I have a couple more questions for you. I said, what's the population of the world? He says, I don't know. I have to go check Wikipedia. I said, let me save you the trouble. It's about 6 billion. I said, is there something I don't know that you should be telling me? Maybe there's been a law that's been passed that says every man, woman, and child, and perhaps every pet in every household has to have a Netflix subscription. Maybe if that is true, then your valuation holds. He says, don't be absurd. I said, I'm not the one estimating $600 billion in revenues. He said, but I was just using the numbers. I said, what are you talking about? He said, I used last year's subscriber growth and I put that into my Excel spreadsheet for the next 10 years. Of these choices are impossible valuations made. That's an impossible valuation. Here's a final example of an impossible valuation. And this is a very technical impossible valuation. You know how when you do valuation, you build up to a cash flows, you have your after-tax operating income, then you have depreciation, then you have capex, then you have change in working capital to get to cash flow. It's a standard way in which cash flows are computed. And these are all line items, and you stop thinking about them as connected, you think of them as individual line items. So here's what you do. You take depreciation, you project it out. You take capex, you project it out. You take working capital, you project it out. Let's take depreciation and capex. Can depreciation be higher than capex for a company next year? Absolutely. Your company might not have much capex next year and still have depreciation from past years. Can depreciation be higher than capex for the next 5 years? Yes, it's unusual, but it can happen. Can depreciation be higher than capex forever? So if you get to your terminal year, you set depreciation at 20% above capex and it goes on forever. Can't happen. You know why? Because what do you get to depreciate? It's whatever your capex is. Impossible valuations. I'll make a statement and I can back it up if you want. 1 in 4 valuations that I see coming out of investment banks and consulting firms are impossible valuations. There's no point even discussing the details of the value. They're just plain impossible. You're telling me a fairy tale. Why should I waste my time talking about whether the fairy tale is realistic or making it more realistic? Let's talk about improbable valuations. Implausible valuations. Implausible valuations, you're telling me a story that's difficult to back up but can happen. Here's the first one. That you can grow as a company without reinvesting. That's a tough trick to pull off. One of my students actually works for the NFL, the National Football League. Think of this as the IPL on steroids. It's the most valuable sports franchise in the world. So he was valuing an NFL team. And in his valuation, he put in a 3% growth rate. This team owns its own stadium. And when he projected the cash flows, he seemed to be putting no money back maintaining the stadium. No reinvestment in the stadium. So I called him on it and I said, no, I see the growth. I see that you're getting cash flows. How come you're not putting money back into the stadium to sustain that growth? He said, that's easy. Every time we have to invest in the stadium, here's what we do. We go to the city that we're in and we threaten them. Threaten them with what? In the US, increasingly, professional sports teams threaten to leave a city and go to another city. So we're going to leave you and go to Las Vegas or San Diego. We have a better deal there. And the city picks up the tab. Now that's an implausible valuation, but now that I've heard your reason for it, I'm going to let it go. Here's another example. Earlier this year, I was in Dubai doing a 2-day valuation seminar, and I picked a Saudi company to value. And I'll make a confession, I don't know that many Saudi companies. So the company I picked was a company called Al Marai, which I'd never heard of until I valued the company. So it's a food processing company. And when I was looking at Al Marai, one of the things that astonished me was the margins were about 20%. And the typical Middle Eastern food company has margins of about 8 to 9%. So I was wondering, why are the margins so high? How come there's not more competition coming in, pushing margins down? So I present this valuation in Dubai, and half the audience are Saudi analysts. And one of them puts up his hand and says, that's easy to explain. He says, take a look at the top stockholders in Al Marai. See who owns the stock. So I pulled that up. And right on top of the list is somebody bin Saud. Basically, it's a member of the Saudi royal family, is a leading stockholder of the company. You're saying, so what? There's your competitive advantage. There's your barrier to entry. It's almost like the Saudi princess standing at the border saying, you can't come in, no competition for my company. Again, an implausible valuation. But now that you've explained where it's coming from, I can sustain. Impossible, implausible. Let's close the cycle. Here are improbable valuations. Whenever I look at a DCF, in fact, halfway through every semester, I ask every person in my class to turn in their discounted cash flow valuations of their companies to me for feedback. Not for a grade, but for feedback. What kind of feedback? I take a look at the valuation and I tell them, maybe you should tweak this number. Maybe this number doesn't make sense. So when they turn in their DCF, they expect me to say profound things like your growth rate should be 23.5%, not 21%. Are you kidding me? I have no idea what your growth rate should be. But here's what I check. I look at three aspects of the valuation. I call these the three sides of the valuation triangle. I look at their growth rate. I look at their reinvestment assumptions. I look at their risk assumptions. So I'm going to throw one side of the triangle at you, and I want you to fill out the rest of the triangle. Let's have a company with high growth. What should I expect to see on the reinvestment side of the triangle? High reinvestment or low reinvestment? I'd expect to see high reinvestment. And when you think about the risk, I expect to see high risk. High makes sense to me. Low makes sense to me. But if you have high growth, low reinvestment, low risk, I'm going to push back and say, tell me what's special about the company. And if you can tell me what's special, I'm going to say, okay, it's an improbable valuation, but I can see why you did it. But if you don't have a reason, I'm going to ask you to stop fighting with yourself, because that's effectively what you're doing, is you're at war with yourself in terms of your assumptions. So let's now turn to a couple of tangents. Let's first turn back to my Uber story to see if my Uber story makes sense. So let me take the Uber story. Is it possible, plausible, probable? It's clearly possible. They're already doing it, urban car service company. It's plausible. They're already successful as an urban car service company. Is it probable? I think they're actually attracting enough new users that most of my story is probable. I'll tell you what I was not willing to do as my story in 2014. I was not willing to accept the story that Uber was going to replace your second car, which some people were actually presenting as a reason for its growth. In 2014, I felt that was a little further out than I was willing to go. So at least for Uber, when I pass it through the test, it looks like the test makes sense. But let's talk about a company where if you'd asked these questions, you'd very quickly have realized you're pushing for trouble. So I'm going to tell you a story. And for the moment, don't even look at that picture, the slide that you have here. But I'm going to tell you a story, and I want you to think like a movie producer and tell me whether this story sounds really good to you. So in this story, here's what happens. So there's a 19-year-old who drops out of Stanford. Think about that. Who drops out of Stanford? What was Stanford's acceptance rate last year? -3%? It's the most selective university in the world. So this 19-year-old gets into Stanford and drops out. So already it's interesting. Most selective school, you dropped out. And to make this an interesting story, a truly unique story, you make this dropout a woman, not a man. Because usually you have geeks dropping out of college, people like Bill Gates and creating big businesses. This is a 19-year-old woman who drops out of Stanford and starts a new business. Not a tech business, but a blood testing business. So here's what a business is going to do. Instead of taking 2 buckets of your blood, which is what blood tests seem to do and take forever to run your test, this business that she started is going to take 2 drops of your blood and in 35 minutes run 32 different tests on this blood and send you the results by email, and it's going to cost you less than $50. Think about it. This sounds like a really good story, right? In fact, you want the story to be true so much that you probably will not even ask questions. I wish I'd made up the story because I didn't. In fact, the woman who dropped out of Stanford was called Elizabeth Holmes. The company she created was called Theranos, which did exactly what I described. Take 2 drops of your blood and claim to run 32 tests on it and turn out the results in 30 minutes for $50. And the company was the story sounded so good that venture capitalists ended up pushing the pricing for this company up to $9 billion at the start of 2015. At the start of 2015, or in the middle of 2015, if you'd asked me about Theranos and said, what do you think about the company? My response would have been, I don't know much about the company, but given the big names putting money into the company, and given the pricing, there must be some real substance of the company. But I was wrong. Let's step back. If you're an investor in a blood testing company, what's a big question you're going to ask the company before you put your money in the company? It's a blood testing company. Not an app company, not a social media company. It's a blood testing company. The question you probably ask is, does that blood test work, right? I assumed that somebody would have asked this question. But I was wrong, because in October of 2015, a Wall Street Journal reporter decided to check this out. This is a company that claims to do 36 tests. Have they been approved for the test? So you went to the FDA, which is where you file the results of the test, and He asked them, has Theranos passed these tests? And the FDA said, we've approved them for one of the 32 tests, but in the other 31, we haven't given them approval. So he said, why? He said, because the tests are noisy. See, what's a noisy blood test? The analogy I would give is you go for a test for leukemia. The results come back. The doctor takes a look and says, you know what? You might have leukemia, but you might not. Don't worry about it. If something bad happens, we'll call you back. It's not exactly what you want in a blood test, right? And that's exactly what was happening in these tests with a lot of noise. So he reports on it. There's a Wall Street Journal story. Theranos pushes back saying, you're being unfair to us. The tests are going through it. But over the next few weeks, bad things start happening in the company. You have rumors coming out about tests that are being cooked up. And over the next few months, as these results come out, piece by piece, the story starts to fall apart. By June of 2016, Theranos was out of business. Elizabeth Holmes had been banned from the blood testing business for the rest of her life. But the amazing thing was that nobody seemed to ask that question on the ride up. And it wasn't just investors. It was the Cleveland Clinic, which is actually one of the leading healthcare organizations in the US, highly reputed. Walgreens, the retail store, was going to add a Theranos lab in every one of their Walgreens. Everybody seemed to buy into that story. And as I was writing about this on my blog, and I wrote about this in October of 2015, that's the question I asked, is why did all these smart people not ask the question? And the answer I could think of at that point in time was they wanted the story to be true so much they did not want to ask the question. And sometimes as investors, we look at a story and we want that story to succeed so much that we're afraid to ask the questions because we're afraid of what the answers might be to those questions. So that's a Theranos story. Let me give you another tangent before we move back to our Uber and Ferrari. Sometimes you can get implausible stories from clusters of people all doing things that are rational. So let's play a game. Let's assume that each of you is an entrepreneur, right? So you know what entrepreneurs are, right? They're daring people, they're confident people, and you see a big market out there. Give the big market a name: cloud computing, online advertising, China. So you're an entrepreneur seeing a big market. What's your first instinct? I can create something for that big market, right? So you come up with an app or a product or service for the big market. You're convinced your product or service is the best one. So you approach me, I'm a venture capitalist. You're an overconfident entrepreneur, venture capitalist, I'm an overconfident venture capitalist, so I think I've picked a winner, so I think you're the winner, I give you capital. So now we have a little cluster, right? You have an overconfident entrepreneur surrounded by overconfident venture capitalists looking at a big market. You're saying, what does that mean, overconfident? Basically, if you're overconfident, what are you doing? You're overestimating your chances of succeeding in the market. You're overestimating revenues, profits, cash flows, value. So in each cluster, here's what you're going to see. You're going to see that cluster overvalue itself. Not because they're being irrational, but because they're overconfident. So if you have a big market, you can have 100 clusters of entrepreneurs with VCs feeding each entrepreneur. And collectively, it's almost a given that the sum of the values of all of these clusters will be too high. You know what we call that, right? We call that a bubble. And then people wag their finger and say, that's terrible, you shouldn't have bubbles. I get at least one journalist calling every week asking me to classify something as a bubble. So I get it. And in fact, I get more of these from Indian journalists than probably any other group. They say, what do you think about this Flipkart OLED? Do you think it's a bubble? And my response is, so what if it is a bubble? Bubbles are a feature of young markets. They're not a bug. That's exactly what you should expect to see when you have a young market or a big market and young companies going after the big market. In fact, in 2015, I took every online advertising company in the world. I took their market caps and I backed out from the market cap what the revenues would need to be 10 years out to justify the market cap today. Then I added up the revenues 10 years out. This is in 2025. And I came up with total revenues of $522 billion. The market is pricing these companies on the assumption that the online advertising market is going to be $522 billion in 2025. You think, so what? The entire online advertising market in 2017 was $160 billion. The market's pricing these companies to deliver a $522 billion market. Something's got to give. I'm not saying every one of these companies, Facebook, Google, etc., is overvalued, but I'm saying collectively, these companies are overvalued, but that's the nature of the process. It's not uncommon in big markets. So the next time you hear this debate about Ola, Flipkart, or whatever the online company of the moment is, recognize that this is part of the process, is bubbles form and bubbles burst because you have overconfident investors and overconfident entrepreneurs going after big markets. It's exactly what you'd expect to see. Which brings me to my final tangent before I get back to my Uber and Ferrari, and that is a discounted cash flow valuation that I saw about 2 or 3 years ago on Tesla. As some of you have probably been reading, Tesla's market cap just exceeded that of GM and Ford's last week. You're saying, so what? Well, Tesla sold 75,000 cars last year. GM and Ford, of course, sell millions of cars, but the market cap for Tesla exceeded that of GM and Ford. So it's clearly a company in the moment with a visionary, right? Elon Musk at its head. So I've been interested in Tesla for a few years now. I like the company. I like Elon Musk. And I'm not sure I'd buy the company at the prevailing prices. I think it's just too richly priced. So I do valuations on my blog of Tesla off and on. I've done this since, 2014. So about a year and a half ago, I valued Tesla. I come up with about 150. The stock's trading at 220. And simultaneously, there's an equity research report that comes out of, I won't name the investment bank, where an equity research analyst has put a buy recommendation in Tesla and a target price of $500 per share. So I'm surprised. Why is his value so high? So I pick up the equity research report, I thumb through it, and I come to this page where he's done what he calls a D.C.F. That's how he described it, of Tesla. So this is the page with the D. And I said, okay, let me take a look at your D.C.F. So I take a look at the numbers, and part of what I saw surprised me. First, when I looked at his revenues, because I expected his numbers to be a lot more optimistic than mine, because after all, his value is almost 3 times higher than mine. So I look at his revenues, and he's projecting that Tesla's revenues are going to increase dramatically over the next 10 years, just like I was, and that the number of cars Tesla is going to sell is going to increase from 24,000, which is what they sold in the last 12 months, to 1.1 million 10 years out. Now, before you laugh, that's not implausible. Remember, Tesla announced the Tesla 3 a year and a half ago, right? The Tesla 3 they haven't even built the assembly lines. There's no prototype car. It's not even going to come out till 2018. And 400,000 people put down money to get Tesla 3s. There's something special about the company. So the 1.1 million is clearly a reach, but it's plausible. So I said, that's fine. I could look at the revenues. And his revenues were actually not that much higher than mine. So I was a little surprised. I looked at the margins saying maybe they're higher. His margins were actually lower than mine. Now I'm completely befuddled. How's your value so much higher than mine if your revenues are close to mine and your margins are lower than mine? So I take a look at his net capex. We look at that second to last line. It's tough to read that. The capex, depreciation. So I look at his capex and I notice that his capex is barely above depreciation as he goes through time. It looks like he's not putting much money back into the business. No reinvestment happening. Now here's the problem. Tesla is an automobile company, right? The number of cars they're producing right now is 24,000. The number of cars they're expecting to produce in 10 years is 1.1 million. They have an assembly plant in Fremont which has a capacity of about 150 to 2,000 cars. 200,000 cars. But they are projecting 1 million plus. So if you're going to produce 1 million cars, you need to build assembly lines, and you're not setting aside money to cover these assembly lines. So I called the analyst. He was actually on his in an airport on his way to California to visit Tesla. I don't know what he was planning to do there. So I said, I've been looking at your D.C.F, and I have a question for you. I said, I noticed the number. He said, I can't answer any questions. I said, why not? He said, well, I don't actually work on the numbers in my evaluations. I have a team that does it. I said, okay, how big is your team? He said, 5 members. And I said, 5 people churned out this DCF? He said, yes. I said, I'll call you next week when all 5 of you are together or with you and I can ask questions. He said, okay. So a week later I called back and all 5 are lined up there. And the lead analyst says, I don't do this kind of stuff. I'm the chief schmoozer. The second analyst says, I'm the secondary schmoozer. And one by one, it passes down the ranks. And it turns out that the entire DCF was done by the 23-year-old they hired out of business school last year. He was the poor guy given the role of crunching out the numbers. So I feel really sorry for this kid. So I said, no, when I look at your valuation, I have a question for you. I notice the number of cars you're selling goes from 25,000 to 1.1 million, but I notice you're not building any assembly plants to accommodate the cars. He says, no, I'm putting in CapEx. I'm saying, but my response was, the CapEx you're putting in is barely above depreciation. You're basically maintaining your Fremont plant. There's no new plant here. He says, you're right. It slipped my mind. I said, what slipped your mind? That you have to build plants. I said, don't you think it's a problem? He says, I agree it's a problem, but how do we we can't tell the world we messed up and forgot to build plants. He said, what should I do? I said, I have a suggestion for you. I said, have you ever watched this movie, Willy Wonka's Chocolate Factory? He said, no, but one of the older analysts had. I said, in that movie, one thing always puzzled me. Willy Wonka chocolates are all over the world. Every store you go into, there are Willy Wonka chocolates, but there's one factory. One very inefficiently laid out factory with chocolate rivers flowing through it and strange looking characters in it. And it always puzzled me as to how this one factory produced all these chocolates that were all over the world. The answer is actually in the movie. If you see the movie, if you get a chance, watch the movie. There are these magical little creatures called Oompa Loompas. All through the movie, they dance through the movie. And they're magical. They do this and chocolates come out of their hands. So here's the new story you have to put out. Tell the world that Tesla has fired all its regular workers in its Fremont plant and replaced them with Oompa Loompas. That will take care of your valuation. Magically, cars will come out. Everything's going to... I call these Oompa Loompa valuations. And you'll be amazed again how many discounted cash flow valuations I see, where analysts build in this huge growth rate, but they don't set aside the reinvestment to cover that growth. Is it possible? Is it plausible? Is it probable? And at the end of the process, you want to make sure that you have a story that you can defend in front of. So now I'm ready to convert my story into numbers. So let me revisit my Uber story and take each part of the story and convert into numbers. So do you remember the story? I described Uber as an urban car service company, right? So my total market becomes the urban car service market, which is about $100 billion. So there's my first number. Urban car service company gives me a market of $100 billion. I also described Uber as attracting new people into that market. People like my son would normally not take the car service business. The way this shows up in my valuation is the traditional car service business grows about 2% a year, but I'm going to allow it to grow 6% as new customers come into the market. So there's the new customers coming in, convert to a number. I described Uber as having local networking benefits. What does that mean? Well, because you dominate a city but not the world, your market share cannot be 50-60%. You're going to end up with a 10%, maybe 12% market share. The market share I gave Uber because of that part of the story was a 10% market share. Urban car service company, new customers, local networking benefits. I also said that Uber can continue to do what they've done, which is not own the cars, not hire the drivers, and therefore growing in a new city is easy to do. The way this manifests itself is they're going to be able to grow with relatively little reinvestment. Not Oompa Loompa level reinvestment, but relatively little reinvestment. For every dollar they invest, they're going to get $5 of sales, which is about 2.5 times larger than what a typical US company gets. And finally, for the risk, I didn't waste my time doing betas and cost of equity and cost of capital. I gave Uber a 12% cost of capital, which put them at the 95th percentile of cost of capital for US companies. I made them a risky company. And because they're still a young company that's losing money, I built in the probability of 10% that they would not make it. That's it. Every part of my story has now become a number. And those are the numbers that you're going to see in my valuation. Now let's take the Ferrari part of the story and see how the Ferrari exclusive club story turns to numbers. I describe Ferrari as an exclusive club. So the way this manifests itself is my revenue growth is only 4%. You're saying that's low, but I have to keep it low because I can't let them sell more and more cars because that'll cut into the exclusivity. But the good news is I give them high margins and a low cost of capital. High margins because you can sell at these high prices and have no advertising costs, and low cost of capital because they're selling to people who are so rich that they don't feel the effects of the economy. I've converted my Ferrari exclusive club story into numbers that I'm going to use in my valuation. So now, let me put up my valuation of Uber. When you look at this valuation, it looks like a spreadsheet, right? It's built on revenue growth and margins and reinvestment and cash flows and cost of capital. And if I just showed you the spreadsheet, you'd probably say, just another spreadsheet valuation. But I'm going to argue that if you point to any number in this spreadsheet and ask me, why is that number what it is? My answer is going to be a story, not a number. Let me explain. If you ask me, why are Uber's revenues 3.8 billion in year 10? The answer you're going to get from me is because I think Uber is an urban car service company with local networking benefits. And I'm going to connect that part of the story to the 3.8 billion. So at the end of this process, every number in that spreadsheet comes from my story. And if I change my story, those numbers will change. The bottom line is, with my story in June of 2014, the value that I got for Uber was about 6 billion. What was the Wall Street Journal story that attracted my attention? That VCs that invest in Uber at a pricing of 17 billion, right? So I put up a $6 billion value. I posted this on my blog. And 15 minutes later, I get a call from a Wall Street Journal reporter. She must have been waiting for the post to come out. She says, I saw your post in Uber, and I saw you valued Uber at 6 billion. I said, yes. She said, but the VCs have priced it at 17 billion. I said, yes. And she said, how do you explain the 17 billion? I said, I don't have to. I didn't pay it. I have never felt the urge to go around explaining what other people pay. The VCs want to pay 17 billion. It's their money. What business is it of mine to wag a finger and say, you crazy guys, you shouldn't be doing it? And this is why I don't feel the urge to go around telling investors in Flipkart they're crazy. It's their money. If they have a story that backs up what they're doing, all the more power to them. Don't invest my money in your story. Invest your own money. I have no problem with that. Based on my story and my valuation, I would not invest in Uber. But if you wanted to, you should do it on your story and your numbers. I am a great believer that investors have to take ownership of their decisions. You know what I mean by ownership? I will never buy a stock because Bill Ackman likes it or Warren Buffett bought it. I will buy a stock because I have a story that backs up my buying the stock. And unless I get to that point, I've turned over my investing to somebody else, and that's not a good place to be. So let's see how the Ferrari story turns into a value. Okay? So if you look at the Ferrari story, the 4% revenue growth means my revenues don't grow very fast, but my margins stay high, my cost of capital is low. The end result of that story is I get a value of about 6.3 billion euros. And this was a month before the IPO for Ferrari. My exclusive club story for Ferrari gives it a value of about 6.3 billion. It actually went public at about 8 billion. Its price dropped afterwards to about 7 billion. It's now about 9 billion. I have to update the story and the valuation, but at the time of the IPO, if you ask me, do you want shares in Ferrari? My answer is no, thank you. It doesn't fit my story and my valuation of the company. So the bottom line is both of these valuations, what we're doing actually is completely consistent with building numbers around a story, but it's a story that's driving the numbers, not an Excel spreadsheet. Which brings me to my fifth and final step in this process. You've told a story. You converted the story into numbers. You have a valuation. You present it to other people. As I said, when you present your valuation, you want people to pat you on the back and say, amazing job, I'd value the company just like that. And as I also said, that's the worst place for you to hang out. Don't hang out with people who think just like you. The problem is, you all take the same classes, you're taught the same thing, you read from the same books. After a while, we all think like each other. You want to seek out unconventional groups that disagree with you. And with Uber, I got incredibly lucky, and here's why. My Uber post got picked up in 4 very different places. The first was a site called 538. I don't know whether you've heard of this site, but it's a site run by a guy called Nate Silver. He's a statistics geek. It's a great site. If you get a chance, visit it. He uses numbers on everything, sports, on politics. Basically, he's a numbers guy who loves numbers. So it got picked up at 538. It also, exactly the same post that I had on my blog, it also got picked up in the Forbes blog. Forbes blog is read by older value investors, traditional investors. It got picked up in TechCrunch. If you've never heard of TechCrunch, TechCrunch is actually a digital magazine read by geeks, tech geeks. So basically, it's a big Silicon Valley magazine. And it got picked up in a blog called the Ride Sharing Guide. This is actually a blog written for drivers of Uber and Lyft cars. So basically there are enough of them that, so it got picked up in and it got 4 very different types of reception in each place. I'll take you through each one. On 538, read by Statistics Geek and Numbers Geeks, the questions are all about details. Why 12% cost of capital? Why isn't it like 11.93%? Why 10% chance of failure? Why not 9.95%? And I always leave my Excel spreadsheets open source so people can change them. Whenever I got a question like that, I sent it back to the person saying, why don't you try changing the cost of capital from 12% to 11.87% and see what it does? And 5 minutes later, I'd get an email back saying, I see now why you use 12%. So a lot of very, very detailed questions about numbers. On the Forbes blog, people who read it loved it. They said, this is the way you should be valuing companies. Those crazy tech people. I didn't even go to that blog. Waste of time. The TechCrunch guys absolutely hated what I did. Their response was, how dare you? How dare you value one of ours? We're a tech company. You're not supposed to be using your D.C.F on our companies. And they picked it apart. They didn't like this. And there was a whole torrent of abuse that came out of it. But along the way was also stuff about technology I would never have known. I'm not a tech guy. I don't know how the ride-sharing business works. I learned lots of things about the ride-sharing business that I don't know. And on the ride-sharing blog, I heard from Uber and Lyft drivers. And I heard interesting things I would never have known otherwise. Things like, hey, I drive in LA and I drive more than 30 hours a week. And if you drive more than 30 hours a week, Uber actually kicks back a portion of that 20% that they keep to you because they want drivers who drive more hours. I would never have known that. So when I talk about keeping the feedback loop open, I'm talking about listening to people who disagree with you. And in fact, in the case of Uber, it all came to fruition about 2 weeks after my original Uber post, when I was sitting in Munich airport waiting for a flight, and I get an email from a guy called Bill Gurley. Bill is actually a very well-known venture capitalist. He's a partner in Benchmark Capital, which happens to be an early venture capital investor in Uber. They invest in Uber when it was a $1 billion company. So I get an email from Bill Gurley, and I knew who he was, so I was surprised. I opened the email, and he says, I read your post on Uber, and I did not like it. I said, okay. He said, I've written my own blog post about your post, taking issue with you, and I've said some mean things about you. It's a blog post to blog post warfare, very high tech. So I just want to let you know. So I close the email. I have an hour and a half left for my flight. Guess where I go? I go to Bill's blog and I check out his post. And it says, the heading for the post says, Damodaran misses by a mile. Get it? Uber driving misses by a mile. And he took issue with every single part of my story. He said, Uber is not just a car service company. It's a logistics company. Notice how words have consequences. Logistics means you're in the car service business, a moving business. All of a sudden, he's expanded his businesses. He said, we're just not urban. We're going to be everywhere. We're going to be in suburbia. We're going to be in towns and villages. And we're going to be everywhere. And he said, we're connecting up with credit card companies and airlines to make for a global network, where if you're flying to Jakarta, there's going to be a little button at the bottom after you've made your airline reservation where you say, do you want an Uber car in Jakarta? And we're going to connect up with people in that way so that we can. So basically, he's changed the story from an urban car service company to an everywhere logistics company with global networking benefits, right? So I read the story. I was fascinated. He thought I was going to be pissed off, but I wasn't. So after I read the story, I emailed him. And I said, do you want me to put a number on your story? He said, what are you talking about? I said, you told a very interesting story. I can give you a value that goes with your story. He said, be my guest. So here's what I did. I actually went back into my spreadsheet and I changed 2 numbers, just 2 numbers. The first is my total market, which is $100 billion, which is the urban car service market. I replaced with a $300 billion total market, reflecting the logistics market. I've tripled the size of the market. And the second change I made was instead of using my local networking benefit 10% market share, I gave them a 40% market share, which is a global networking benefit market share. With those 2 changes put in, the value that I got for Uber was $53 billion. I emailed Bill and said, do you like this number? He said, a lot. And I said, I'm not surprised. But then he said, you know what, this 80-20 mix is probably going to be history. We're going to end up at 90-10 sooner or later. I said, not a problem. 5 minutes later, I emailed him back a valuation with a 90-10 mix and a $29 billion value. He's saying, what does this mean? Does this mean that any number goes? Well, not really, because it basically means that your story frames your valuations. If you guys have startups and the way you describe your startup can already make the difference between being $1 million company and $1 billion company. Travis Kalanick, who is the CEO of Uber, never describes Uber as a car service company. He always talks about it as a transportation company or a logistics company. And that is by design. In fact, in December of 2014, I actually wrote a blog post where I let people build their own valuations of Uber on the blog. So if you visit my blog, you go to December of 2014, this post is still there. And here's what I allowed people to do. At each stage in the story, I let people pick what they thought about the story. So I said, do you think Uber is a car service company, a logistics company, a transportation company, a mobility service? Basically, I let people pick at each stage what they thought about Uber. And at the end of the post, I listed out the values depending on the pathways you picked along the way. And the value for Uber can range anywhere from less than $1 billion, if it's just an urban car service company with no networking benefits, to more than $90 billion, if it's a mobility company with strong global networking benefits. And the reason I look at a table like this is it's hubris on my part. When somebody says, do you think Uber is overpriced at $71 billion? My answer is, given my valuation of Uber, I would not buy Uber at $71 billion. But I'm not going to walk around saying that company's overpriced, that company's underpriced. What business is it of mine what the rest of the world pays for companies? And that's something I want you to keep in mind, because I've noticed, at least in the Indian press, there's this righteousness that comes about old-time investors when they look at these young startups, which is, how dare Ola be worth as much as it is? How dare Flipkart still be around? These companies deserve to go under, and so it's almost like they're praying for these companies not to make it. With these companies, there is a story they're selling. You might not buy into the number that comes from the story, but I will invest in any company at the right price. So I'm not going to sit here and say, I will never invest in Uber. It's too young. It's not got substance. At the right price. If it were trading at $4 billion, I valued it $6 billion, of course I'd buy Uber. I'll invest in Flipkart at the right price. So this becomes more an issue of telling a story and coming up with the value and then seeing if that value is something you can live with. Let me close off with a couple of final things that I want to do here. With the Ferrari story, I finished that story, and one of the responses I got was from an equity research analyst who was tracking Ferrari. And he said, how come you didn't give Ferrari the Maserati story? And for those of you who don't know the Maserati story, Maserati in 2008 looked a lot like Ferrari. It sold about 6,000 to 7,000 cars, had high margins, but was very exclusive. And it decided it didn't want to be that exclusive anymore, so it introduced a new car, a cheaper model called the Ghibli. It's a $100,000 Maserati. And it allowed them to grow at 15% a year for the next 10 years. So that's good, right? Higher revenue growth. But in return for the higher revenue growth, they had to give up on two things. One was that their margins went from 18% down to about 14%. And the second was they were now selling to people who were not super rich, but just very rich. So when the economy wasn't doing well, their revenues reflected it. So basically, if I gave Ferrari the Maserati story, I would give them higher revenue growth. And you notice that in the 12% growth rate. But I'd give them lower margins and a higher cost of capital. And the net effect is if I give them the Maserati story, the value that I get for Ferrari is actually only about 6 billion euros, which is less than what I gave them with the exclusive club. So I sent this to the analyst, and he said, hey, couldn't you have just left the margins at 18%? And he said, that's the problem. You can't just selectively pick the parts of stories that you like and pick parts of other stories that you like and connect them together. That would be like my making a Disney movie which starts with Snow White wandering off into the forest and ends with Cinderella going to the ball. I mean, you can't have 6 different stories all in the same movie. If you tell a story, you got to think it through and connect the numbers to the dots in connecting the story. I'm getting pretty close to the end, so I'm going to just wrap up by suggesting a couple of things. Once you tell a story and you convert it to evaluation, you feel that you're done, right? You get ready to shut down everything. But remember, the world keeps moving. So as the world keeps moving, new stuff happens around you. As new stuff happens around you, your story should change. You take a company like Uber, think of how much has changed since 2014. So I've actually revisited Uber in 2015 and 2016 on my blog. So if you get a chance, take a look at those posts, because what I do is I take every news story I have and look at the effect it has on my story. And here's what's happened. The story has become more expensive. I underestimated how many businesses Uber could be and how big it could get. I overestimated how profitable it could be. So I had some good news and bad news for my storytelling. But the you constantly have to rethink your stories and valuations as new information comes to you. And that's the way I think about markets is I get new information and my job is to revisit my company stories, decide whether I want to change the story. If I do change the story, revalue the company. Okay? So it makes valuation a lot more fun because it means it's just not collections of numbers in Excel spreadsheets that you pump through. It's really connecting stories to numbers. So if you're a storyteller, there's a place for you in finance if you can find enough number crunching skills. If you're a number cruncher, there's a place for you in finance if you can find enough storytelling skills. But if you're just a number cruncher, a pure number cruncher, I have a warning for you. It's only a matter of time before you're outsourced. A machine is always better at being machine-like than you will ever be. So what you're really good at is putting in equations and pulling up numbers from financials and building spreadsheets. You're going to be gone in about 5 to 10 years because it's going to be automated. You're going to be out of a job. So if you want to create a niche for yourself in this new economy, the new business environment you're going to go into, you got to find that melding of skills of storytelling and number crunching that's going to allow you to stay on even as the world around you changes. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say. So I'm going to be open for questions. I'm going to put the headphones on because otherwise I can't answer your questions. So any questions you have, we have about 10 minutes. I'd be glad to answer.
Anybody who wants to ask a question, please.
Sir, I went to IIM Bangalore and I was in one of the stock picking competitions. Most of the people were from IIM Ahmedabad, ISBs, and all the big league MBA colleges. But the companies they have chosen for that competition were very trivial. Means they have chosen Sun Pharma, they have chosen Lupin, all the blue chips. So I don't think there most of the wealth creation can happen there. You can just get around 12%, something like that. So I came up with Wonderla. So somehow, my presentation was not that good, but means I'm not able to feel why people are not, people from such big colleges are not able to understand that wealth creation will not happen in those stocks. So, what's the point behind it?
So let me not make this a fight between colleges. Let's face it, it's much more comfortable valuing an established company. So if I gave you Ready Labs, much easier to value than valuing Ola, right? If I give you, I was going to say Tata Motors, but any of the Tata companies is becoming automatically more difficult to value than a few months ago. But the reality is when you have an established company, you have a story that's already, the way I describe it is think of yourself as a writer and I call you in to finish a book where the person who started writing the book has died. Morbid thought, but has died. If I call you in chapter 33 of the book, and there are only 35 chapters in the book, is your job pretty easy? I mean, I think, in fact, I don't know whether any of you read The Girl Who Kicked the Spider's Web or whatever it is, who kicked the dragon tattoo. Remember that guy died? And then there was a fourth book in the same series written by somebody else. That guy had a really easy job because the characters were all laid out. The story was pretty much told. You basically just had to finish the story. That's the way I think about valuing Ready Labs. There's nothing new I'm going to say. I can't recreate the word. But if you give me an Ola or a Flipkart, that's like being called in chapter 1 or chapter 2 of a book. The entire story is in front of me. I think it's a lot more fun telling stories for young companies than older companies. I actually think the payoff to doing valuation is greater when you have unformed stories, when you have disagreements about stories, than when you have established companies. But here's the problem. If the way you get judged on valuations is on specifics and on details and on precision, guess which valuation is always going to be more precise? A valuation of Ready Labs is always going to be more precise than a valuation of Ola. Think of why. It's not because you didn't do your job, but because there's so much more uncertainty around your valuation with a young company than an older company. Unfortunately, much of valuation, and it's not just in India, but around the world, people are measured with accounting precision. How many line items? How much detail do you have? What do the numbers look like? Did you get your cost of capital to the second decimal point? And I think people are missing the boat on valuation. So I agree with you. I would rather value young companies, but don't expect to win any case competitions from doing this, because the people who judge these case competitions tend to be people who are immersed in detail, who really don't get the excitement, the fun that really goes into truly valuing a company. In fact, with my students, I give them advice when they ask me, what company should I pick to value? I say, go where it's darkest. I say, what do you mean? They pick a nice Ukrainian mining company to value. There are no nice Ukrainian mining companies, in case you're starting to think. I say, never again will you complain about uncertainty after you've done that, because that's where market mistakes are likely to be largest. So, in fact, there's a thought I always have in my valuation class that I leave with people. I say, look, you don't have to be right to make money. You just have to be less wrong than everybody else. Think about it for just a moment. You don't have to be right to make money. You just have to be less wrong than everybody else. And ask yourself where your chances of being less wrong are greater. Is it greater in a mature company where everybody knows what's going on? Or is it greater in a young company where few people are even trying?
Sir, I have one more question. Sir, I was analyzing this company Delta Corp. So it is in the gambling business. So what happened means we are college students, we don't get much information, but somehow we collect information from various sources, but then also it is not complete. So recently I met a fund manager. He told me that that guy Jaidev Modi is the CEO and MD, and her wife is one of the top attorneys in India, and if she is in her position means she was the one who was able to get gambling licenses for Delta Corp. So this kind of information is very crucial. If I'm not having this kind of information, my valuation model would be obviously wrong.
Yeah. Have you tried Google search? Actually, it's amazing what you can find out. This is not 1990 anymore. You can't sit on the excuse of other people know more than you do. We're just poor college students. If you think about the research I did for Uber and Ferrari, there wasn't one piece of private information I used. I didn't talk to any Uber managers. I didn't talk to any Ferrari managers. I didn't talk to any equity research analysts. You know, I did all my research online, and I talked to people. You know what? All you needed to do was talk to people in the gambling business, and you would very quickly find out who's connected, who's not. This is not secret information. So one suggestion I would make is part of our problem in valuation and I mentioned this earlier, was so focused on financial statements and annual reports, and we think that's where the information is, that we forget how much information there is accumulated by listening, not by talking, by listening to other people in the business. If you're valuing a gambling company, talk to a gambler. If you're a gambler, that's good. Talk to yourself. Talk to people in the business. Find out somebody who actually is involved in a casino. You will find out things about these companies you would never find if you keep talking to the management, right? So I sympathize with you that you're college students, but at the same time, I think that the world has become a lot flatter. 30 years ago, if you were stuck in Pilani, you might say, look, I can't get that information. Today that you have a broadband connection, you're 95% of the way there. You just have to expand the way you do research and the kinds of questions you ask.
Experience would help me a lot gaining confidence. So, sir, one more question. Sir, whether we should be going about, sir, the content of CFA is really nice in terms of valuations and business analysis and stuff. So, sir, should we go about doing MBA or CFA would be much better?
What do you guys, in fact, I'm not sure, what degree are you guys getting from BITS Pilani? Is it a PGDM? Is that what it is?
Undergraduate program where we are doing MSc Honors Economics and BE Honors Electrical and Electronics Engineering.
Okay. So you have multiple degrees in things that I don't even understand. Should you do an MBA or a CFA or neither? Let me hedge my answers. Right? I think a CFA is an excellent focus program. If you've decided you're going to be in finance and financial analysis, a CFA is more than sufficient. Right? in the areas which accept CFAs. There will be companies, though, where an MBA is the key to opening the door to moving higher in the organization. Why? Because arbitrarily they decide that if you don't have an MBA, you can't be above a certain rank. That's unfair, but it's reality. So if you go to work in consulting firms or investment banks, my guess is you will get pushed to go for an MBA because for whatever reason, it's a screening process they prefer. The fact that you were accepted to IIM Ahmedabad is in fact the most important day of your life. You now become part of that screening process. So it really depends on what your end game is. If you just want to manage money, you want to be in finance, you can get there with a CFA. You could even get there without a CFA. Much of the CFA material is online. You can pick it up on your own. You don't have to go through any of the process. You can still get much of the knowledge that's in a CFA without getting the degree of a CFA. But if you're going for 1 degree and it's your finance focus, I'd go for a CFA. But if you're still not unclear about where in business you want to be, maybe in marketing, maybe in strategy, then an MBA is a much broader degree. So it'll probably prepare you for lots of different things. No, but I think you can live without either. You can be fine with your degree if you keep learning. To me, that's the key, is learning doesn't happen just in the classroom. It happens all around you. It happens to whoever. You talk to the guy who carries your luggage onto the train. Talk to him. Talk to people. Listen to people, because learning comes from the most uncommon places. We think learning comes from people above us who have PhDs or masters. No, learning comes from everybody around you. You will learn something about something if you keep listening to people around you.
Sir?
Yeah.
Yes, I had a problem. I had a question regarding about how VCs of big companies, like you mentioned that a VC of a big company had a small conflict with how you valued Uber. So about like when you impart such ideals to your students, do they also find any conflict of interest when they are sitting for an interview or value under a company for the first time?
Okay. There was no conflict of interest with Bill Gurley. I mean, he just had a conflict. He doesn't like what I did. So conflict of interest means there's some dual purpose. It was entirely in his right to say, I'm investing in Uber. I think it's worth a lot more. So I didn't view it as a conflict of interest. It's my job, and I'm lucky enough that I don't do consulting. I don't do, I don't do any of the stuff which would put me in a position where the way I describe it is there is no audience in the world where I talk to where I particularly want to be invited back again. So if people hate me after I've said what I want to say, that's fine with me. I have other things I can do with my life. And that's an incredible freedom that I have, that I can go into, so I can, this afternoon, I'm actually supposed to be at Goldman Sachs, so I'm talking to their M&A bankers, and I'm going to tell them mean things. Like, why are you guys even doing valuation? It's a waste of time. You've already decided the deal makes sense. Why go through this dance of, I'm coming up with cash flows and discount rate? And some of them are not going to like what I say. But part of the reason they want to hear me is I have absolutely no agenda here. I have nothing, no conflicts. So with my students, could there be a problem is if they're interviewing with a VC that they could say something that will cost them the job? That's a decision they have to make. Here's the way I feel about it. If you're going to lose a job at an interview because you spoke your mind and you were open about what you thought, is this really a job you want to be doing with the rest of your life? That's really the question, right? Because I would assume that part of the reason you're in school is because you want to think through things independently. You want to come to your own judgments, and you want to be free to disagree, even with your bosses, with your managing director. When you feel that something is not done right, not in a disagree, you can disagree without being disagreeable. You can say, look, why are we doing things that way? That doesn't make sense. And I think that if you view the interview process as such that I have to get a job at Morgan Stanley, therefore I'm going to tell the interviewer whatever he or she wants to hear, then by all means, hold back on your thoughts. So find out what he thinks is true about a company, then tell him whatever he thinks is true, and he's going to say, you're amazing, you think just like me. I don't particularly like hanging out with people who think just like me. So I tend to put what I think out there, but I'm lucky. I know that I have the luxury of being able to say what's on my mind and not have consequences, but to the extent that you can have consequences, you might have to kind of censor yourself as you go along.
come in front.
Go ahead.
Hello.
Yes, I can hear you.
Sir, when we were talking about telling stories, I wanted to talk about a specific sector, which is the IT sector. Now,
Okay.
the stories for each of the IT sectors is changing almost every day. We see growth, the percentage is changing every day. So, what according to you is, where is this dynamic IT sector heading towards? Is it going towards less valuation, or is it sustainable, or will this industry at the end collapse?
The way I describe tech, every company has a life cycle, right? It's born, it grows, it matures, it declines, it dies, just like human beings do. And the way I describe tech companies is tech companies age in dog years. You heard of dog years, that you age about 7 times faster? So the way I think about tech companies is tech companies grow much faster than traditional companies. They go from nothing to high growth in 15 years. Take Microsoft, right? Founded in 1979, by the late 90s, the largest market cap company in the world. You know how long it took GM to go from startup to the largest market cap company? It took almost 75 years. So if you're a tech company, you grow faster. That's the good news. The bad news is tech companies age faster. So they basically decline faster. A 20-year tech company is like a 140-year-old manufacturing company. So with that setup, think about Infosys. Think about Tata Consulting Services. Think about all the big names in the tech space. These are now old, mature companies. I don't know why people are surprised. The story I've been telling about Infosys is that it's a mature company. And it's a story that hasn't changed that much, at least from my perspective, in the last 4 or 5 years, because you could see this coming. Growth was already dropping off. It was more hope than reality that was keeping people's growth rates up. Because you look at the size of the company, you look at the business, you look at how it's maturing, the story you had to start telling about these companies had to start reflecting that they were mature companies about 4 or 5 years ago. Finally, the market is catching up. I don't think they will die necessarily, but things are going to get, it's like when you age.